and good to have you with us in this edition of the Urban Debate. It's a special broadcast with a special focus on United States and the presidential elections because it isn't over yet, viewers. Many would have hoped that by now we would have had a clear name, we would have known who the next US president would be. But in fact, we are far from that. The battle, if anything, has become a lot more dramatic, full of suspense. And now it comes down to a handful of states. And very, very slowly, as each and every postal ballot gets counted, those numbers are changing very, very slowly, viewers. It's now possible that by tomorrow morning or even later, we may or may not have any clarity on who has won this election. And in the middle of that, there are still concerns of some kind of a protest and unrest. In the middle of that, there is already charge and countercharge of election fraud, threats of legal battle with the two sides gearing up their own legal strategy and legal teams being on standby. Just to tell you, though you must know it by now already, the candidate who wins the US presidential race needs 270 Electoral College votes to become the US president. Joe Biden, the Democrat candidate, so far is maintaining a lead, although a narrow lead. He is projected to have won 224 Electoral College votes, while Donald Trump is projected to have got 213 of these Electoral College votes. But the battle isn't over yet, and so we don't know. Meanwhile, Donald Trump claims they have won, and he is now threatening to move the US Supreme Court. He's called the election by himself, said we were ready for a win, we have. He's justified it by going into the details of some of the key states that have actually voted in larger numbers this time around for Donald Trump. But if you see at the final figure right now, it's a very different picture. Meanwhile, both teams have claimed that they're ready for a legal battle. In a first very interesting turn of events, the Democrats have won Arizona, taken it back from Republic. So that one key swing state that was very, very closely watched is back in the Democrat camp. Now, let's talk about some of the other states. That's what I want to take you through before we explain to you why there is so much of a delay and before we actually go across to Washington, D.C. to get you the live updates. So let's take a look at some of the key states. Now, the big wins for Joe Biden obviously include California, but that's no surprise. Nobody thought California would vote otherwise. A very, very strong Democrat supporter base there, and that's directly gone into Joe Biden's account. 55 electoral votes there. Then comes the New York, that also has voted very clearly in favor of the Democrats and Joe Biden. 20 electoral votes there going from New York to Joe Biden. After that comes New Mexico. It's considered one of the bellwether states. New Mexico also voting in favor of Joe Biden, and Illinois, another very big state. So these are the key big ones that have gone in favor of the Democrats. Let's look at where Trump has performed really well. Not all of them are surprises. So, for example, Missouri, a bellwether state, has given a majority of votes to Donald Trump. The interesting one is Florida. And in fact, in Florida, if you look at the details, Donald Trump seems to have bettered his own performance from last time. Tennessee is another state. The big ones that are usually the experts watch for one way or the other, Iowa and Ohio, they have also gone in favor of Donald Trump. In fact, in his comments, Florida and Ohio were the states that Donald Trump also emphasized on to say, well, look at this. People have voted more for me this time in better, stronger numbers. And which is why I say that I have won this election. And of course, then there is Texas that has also gone fully all red, all Republican. But let's talk about the ones that everybody is keeping an eye on. And these are the ones where counting is still being done, and there are millions of votes that are left. So the undecided ones, if you take a look at it, we'll begin with Pennsylvania. And this is going to be one of the states that perhaps gives us the numbers the last. That's because, viewers, as far as Pennsylvania is concerned, their counting for the mail ballots only started extremely late. And so all of those numbers and those votes still have to be factored in. And this is a big state. It has 20 electoral college votes, which is why it will be very important to see which way Pennsylvania goes. Then let's take a look at the other ones which are there, where again it's undecided right now. Wisconsin. Here, Joe Biden has a bit of a lead, but it's very, very narrow lead. 49.5% votes for him. For Trump, 48.8% votes. 97% of the votes are in for Wisconsin. So perhaps, if not tonight, for us by tomorrow morning, we will have clarity on Wisconsin. Let's look at the other three of the states that are still left. On your screens right now is North Carolina. Here, Trump has a bit of a lead at about 50.1%. Joe Biden has a vote share of about 48.7%. 95% of the votes are already in. Yet, none of the channels are really going out and calling this election yet as well. Let's look at the other two more states which are on everybody's radar. Michigan has 16 electoral votes in all. Very close, neck to neck. Biden at 49.3, Trump at 49.1, and 90% of the votes have been counted. So there is still 10% that is left. And the last one, Georgia, where Trump has a lead, 50.5%, and Biden at 48.3%. 92% votes have been counted. Georgia also has 16 electoral votes. So it's still very close to call, which is why you're seeing various kinds of comments being made on all sides. Let's say good evening to our panelists. Of course, in the studios with me and will be armed with lots of insights and information is our managing editor, Vinay Tiwari. We'll also have Shubhajit Roy, associate editor of the Indian Express, Narayan Lakshman, associate editor and former US correspondent for the Hindu, Professor Harsh Pant, Director for Studies and Head of Strategic Studies Program at ORF. But first up, let's just directly go across to Natalie Jennings, editor of The Fix at the Washington Post, joining us live from Washington, D.C. Natalie, thanks so much for being back with us. I'm sure you've had a very, very busy 24 hours, but you guys have kept all of us in suspense. When will we know who's won this presidential race?
Glad to be with you again. Yes, it has been really eventful in some ways that we knew were possible, but still feel very unexpected now that we're seeing how close this is. I think it's possible that we will know. So it's morning in the U.S. I think it's possible that we will have an idea who won the Electoral College, who won some of those key states that you just ticked through. Georgia, Michigan, seems likely that we will know those. And if those go for Biden, we will basically know the winner of the race. However, what happens then is what President Trump promised last night, which is he promised to fight results, to go to courts and litigate issues where he sees them in those states. So even though we might have races called tonight, rather later today here in the U.S., I think we are in for a long day or a long week ahead of, really feeling solidly like both sides are accepting this result. Both sides saying, agreeing that one or the other won.
Okay, so Natalie, let me just then go by one, a couple of these states that we're looking at. And let's talk about Pennsylvania. It has a large number of electoral votes. And we've seen some of the reports that suggest that it could take longer. If you can explain it to our viewers, why is that? What was the delay in even beginning the count there?
Yeah, so it's important to remember that there's not a national standard for elections here. Every individual state sets the rules for how they conduct their elections, when they will accept ballots coming in by mail, and when people can start counting them. So Pennsylvania, of all the states left that could be called, is the biggest share of the prize. Its 20 votes mean that if one of these candidates picks that up, that's a major win for them. Pennsylvania did not count any of its ballots until yesterday. And it still has a lot that are outstanding. So it is the biggest prize and also one we expect to potentially take the longest. It's also the one where we could see the greatest number of legal challenges.
Okay, in fact, let's talk about the legal challenges. Now, President Trump has already said and warned of going to the US Supreme Court and alleged that this is a election fraud. What should we expect from here on if the two sides do mount a legal battle? What could that entail?
I think what we will see is them litigating maybe, it'll be really small issues in these really important states that a small amount of votes could decide things. President Trump said he's going to the Supreme Court. He can't just do that. When you have a court case, you have to go through lower courts. And of course, he thinks the Supreme Court is tilted in his favor. So he would like to go straight there. But that won't happen. You'll have to go through several legal challenges before you get there. But you could see things like, a certain amount of ballots that the Trump administration doesn't want to have counted, or they think it's taking too long. I think potentially the judiciary will go with whatever the state thinks should happen, but it will mainly make things really protracted, and it will cause tension here in the United States as this plays out, as people say, pick a side and say, this is one more thing to fight over at a very tense time.
Right, Natalie Jennings, appreciate you joining us and giving us some more clarity on which way this battle could be headed. Thank you so much. Well, there you heard it from live from Washington D.C. That was Natalie Jennings of the Fix to the Washington Post, and of course they've had a long night, and perhaps they're going to have many long days as well as the results get slowly counted. Let's talk a little bit more about that. And let me go across to Vinay Tiwari on that. Vinay, everybody did anticipate a little bit of delay because of the mail-in posts, but perhaps not so much. Like Natalie was telling us, in Pennsylvania, they still have almost a 1/4 of the votes to be counted.
That's right, Tanvi. And look, I mean, Indian election of Bihar, the grand finale, the counting is happening on 10th of November, which is also the day the IPL final is being played. And you can be sure that much like the IPL final, we'll possibly know in less than 4 hours who's going to win Bihar. But that's not what happens in the United States. They play a test match and it can take days before you actually know what happens. And if that was not complicated enough, this year's election happening in the middle of the pandemic in a country that's possibly the most affected by it has just complicated things way more. How have they complicated? 100 million people have actually voted ahead of election day. Now remember, in the United States, the electorate is actually allowed to send in postal ballots in advance. It's something that happened in the previous election as well, but only about 50 million people did that in 2016. This election, about 100 million people have actually mailed and posted their ballot papers ahead of the day of actual voting, which is November 3rd. Now that changes the entire equation because that's the sheer volume of it makes the job slower and a little more complicated. And this particular surge obviously is happening because there was a great amount of fear of the pandemic, which has kept people indoors. Also remember that Joe Biden in many ways used it as a calling card, didn't campaign as much, even as Donald Trump flitted from state to state, jet-setted around most of the battleground states and did a very public campaign, so to speak, even though Joe Biden took a little bit of a backseat and didn't come out as much as people possibly expected him to do. Now, mail ballots pretty obviously take longer to count and process. Now, the word process here is very important to understand because that's something that Indian audiences may not be familiar with. When a postal ballot envelope arrives at the precinct office, it has to be first tallied in terms of a signature on top of the envelope along with the signature on the ballot paper so that, it can be verified that the person who sealed the envelope is the person who actually posted it. Also, there is some kind of an identity document that is photocopied and kept along with it. Now, that has to be verified and checked as well. That takes time. And this particular time has been multiplied into 2 as opposed to what happened the last time. The other critical thing about verification is very important because simply, unlike the Indian election system where every person, voter has a voter ID card, there is an electoral roll. You go to the polling station, you show your ID card, the electoral officer will check your name against it, take your signature, you go to the EVM and you punch and you're done. Now, I'm sure most Indians have now realized in 2020, we appear far more efficient than possibly the oldest democracy in the world. Now, that is not all in terms of complications. in the United States, there is no equivalent of an election commission like in India, where there are rules are uniform across states. They have a federal system where all the 50 states may have varying rules and different rules, and that just complicates the matter further, because some states allow the processing and the counting to start ahead of the voting day, even though the declaration can only happen after November 3rd, and some states don't allow that at all. They really can start only on the 3rd of November, which is what is happening in Pennsylvania, where the pre-process is not being allowed by the law of that state, and it can only start from the November of 3rd. So it takes a little longer. So obviously that adds to the there is one other complication which I think most Indians would be unfamiliar with. Look, in India, from Aizawl to Ahmedabad and from Salem to Srinagar, it's one time zone. So everything starts at the same time and ends at the same time, whether it is polling or counting. United States has multiple time zones, and that also makes a difference in terms of the number of hours when the polling starts and when it ends. So maybe the East Coast has started counting even while the West Coast is still polling. So that just adds a little bit more to the confusion and complication of the way the US election process and democracy actually functions, Tanvi.
Vinay, I am still trying to figure how did you manage to include cricket and IPL even in this conversation, which was essentially about delay in counting. But, that's just your passion speaking there, I'm sure.
That's one. And also, look, Indians find it easier to understand any analogy of cricket, I guess, no?
Yes,
I mean, this is the time when we can use it pretty effectively.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And of course, Bihar elections. And I know there is a bit of a pain point there that the fact that the IPL finals are happening on the same day, that we're going to be extremely caught up with the Bihar elections. Let's hope there is a lot more clarity in that one, unlike the presidential elections that we are staring at right now. Thanks so much for taking us through all of those details. Let's just take it across to our panelists who've patiently waited by as well, and open it up for a conversation. And I actually was wondering if any of our guests would like to, begin by talking about if this could have been any easier or any simpler. Smita, do you want to start off with that? I mean, of course, it's times of a pandemic, so they would have had to come up with another option. But could this have been simpler?
Well, if 2016 hadn't seen the victory of Donald Trump, maybe 2020 would have been simpler, Tanvi. Good evening to you. And in fact, just let me quickly add here that having known Vinay for very long, having worked with him, if he hadn't brought in that IPL reference, I would have really been surprised. But I mean, seriously, look, I think 3 quick points here before you go over to your other panelists. A, what Donald Trump did, and I think I mentioned it in one of your shows earlier, that Donald Trump has been the global disruptor, and today he officially was the biggest disruptor in American domestic politics and its history of democratic values and ethics by making in that premature, in fact, announcement, declaration of victory, and a very bizarre, in fact, demand that that stop counting the votes. I mean, American laws require for every ballot to be counted, and in every election, of course, it's the strength of every vote that counts. So if the president had, waited out for the results, if maybe Biden was seen to be emerging with a wafer-thin majority or a win, then if Donald Trump had said that, look, I am not sort of convinced that these results are right, I want to recount, I'm going to take them to court, it would have made sense. But for the president of the oldest democracy to say that I don't even want the votes to be counted, which have already been pulled in, that's bizarre, but that's something that is deliberate. It's not something that he hasn't thought about in terms of repercussions. And I think what's going to play out from here on is, of course, there's going to be a long legal political drama. I mean, looking at the numbers, by the time the counting gets over, Biden could actually still manage a sort of a thin majority or, get past that number of 270. But there will be a legal battle that will be protracted in a sense, which will be complicated by the fact that in US, adding to all the other complications, your House of Representatives is governed by Democrats, your Senate is governed by the Republicans. Even if you look at the battleground states, Tanvi, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, they actually all have Democratic governors and Republican-controlled legislatures. So if you were to look at the past precedents, where in the case of Florida, where the Republican-controlled legislature then actually considered submitting its own electors to the Supreme Court before that war, that fight between Al Gore and George Bush came to an end, it's going to be politically much more difficult to reconcile these differences in such a divided and polarized America of today.
Yes, and that's perhaps going to be one of the longer term impacts as well, the kind of division and polarization that's taking place. Let's also say good evening to Mr. Pinakranjan Chakravarti, former Secretary for Ministry of External Affairs. Thank you so much for being with us. And Sanjay Kapoor, senior journalist. Just to pick up on one of the points that Smita made, Mr. Sanjay Kapoor, in India, counting and voting works very differently. Voting has to be done and dusted and sealed properly, set aside, and then we wait a few days and then we start counting and announce the results. In US, we have a situation where at one part they're already announcing the results. In the other part, they're still about getting ready to go and cast their vote. So in such a scenario, when Donald Trump stands up and says, halt it, how is that even possible? How does that work?
Drawing comparison with India is, don't think really works when you trying to describe the US. US has multiple systems rolled into one, and it's so complicated that it requires great amount of analysis and people actually delving into different aspects. So when Mr. Trump says that he will stop counting, he wants counting to be stopped. People are surprised and they watch it with mirth and sometimes with great suspicion as to what he's really driving at. Fundamentally because in the US, as Smita rightly pointed out, all votes need to be counted. But the other thing that really comes up is that when Mr. Trump says that the ballots, he doesn't trust the ballot paper, it also shows that he's not very sure where he stands. He's on a very unstable ground. He thinks whatever votes have come in, he could make do with it and stop the other set of ballot papers to come in, because the studies have shown that the Republicans vote by stepping into a polling booth, whereas all the Democrats, especially during the time of pandemic, sent in their ballot paper. So you see the amount of ballot papers that jumped from 2016 to 2020. And the reason why they did it is because the Democrats were very, very cognizant of the harmful, malefic impact of the pandemic. They didn't want to step out. They were wearing masks. They were maintaining social distance. And they thought the best way to vote in this election, which was very critical for them, is to send it out to ballot paper. And Mr. Trump recognizes that what has been counted are largely the votes which came in on the 3rd, and what will be counted, as Mr. Tiwari also pointed out, are the ones which have been sent through ballot paper, and that requires a long process. I mean, it's something that will probably delay the entire counting, and because as the Pennsylvania laws suggest, that till the time the entire votes are in and the first round of voting is over, that is when they start counting on the 3rd, after the 3rd cell. So in a way, we cannot draw comparison with India. India, we have misgivings about why we take so much time after the polling is over to the time when the counting begins. I think there is great merit in starting counting right away. It used to happen in the early days, but now there's so much of EVM movement, and there's a question that we have raised time and again with the Election Commission, that do not create any kind of suspicion in the minds of people that the EVM would be changed or things will go wrong by having a large gap between the day of counting and the day of polling. So that's how the two countries work, and there are many countries in different parts of the world which agree that the counting and the polling should happen one after another. But in the US, different time zones, different regions, and they have their own way of going about it.
Yes, you are absolutely right. And of course, there is no direct comparison. But for our viewers to understand, because this is the system that we know very well. And of course, it is important to repeatedly highlight how the American system is so different. Just on a side note, though, on a day when United States is actually facing this entire suspense and confusion because of the millions of ballot votes, back home in our own country, we had one of our biggest names in politics, Rahul Gandhi, actually take on the government over the electronic voting machines. And I don't know if anybody informed him that, well, right now the debates about how bad or how problematic paper ballots can be, but he went on a tirade against the government over the EVMs, or the Modi voting machines as he calls it. Anyways, Mr. Pinakranjan Chakravarti, let's also talk about how much of this was anticipated by the Republicans, perhaps in the run-up, and maybe both sides. But Donald Trump was pretty much setting up the stage for this. He's repeatedly been warning about unrest. He's repeatedly been warning about delay. He's repeatedly been saying that they would want to delay announcing the final result, but it should happen on November 3rd. Now, for our viewers to understand, why would he push for that kind of a response?
Because as we all know, that he, I think, felt a little apprehensive, primarily because of the way he handled the COVID, and even his all his campaigning, where people came without masks, and they actually turned out to be super spreader events, as they call it. So I think he got the sense from going all over the place that certain sections of the people who were his supporters had turned away from him, particularly, let's say, the older people who knew that their lives were in danger. So I think those were some of the factors. Coming back to a question you had raised right in the beginning, can't they have a simpler system? I'm sure they can. Just abolish the Electoral College, have a direct election, and count all the votes. What is called the popular votes there. Because if you remember, in 2016, Mr. Trump got less number of popular votes than Hillary Clinton, but he won the election because of this skewed system that they have of sending electors to the Electoral College. Each state has a particular number. Anyway, there's a long history of why that is, and it's an old democracy, so they try to balance various states, small and big, etc. But the point is, why is he doing all this now? Because he knew that this may turn out to be a very, very, a close cliffhanger. Hence, he had prepared. Oh, by the way, they had already gone to court to contest the Pennsylvania time schedule of counting votes. But the court actually was tied 4-4, I think. There was a bench, actually. And so the court did not overturn the Pennsylvanian time schedule of counting votes. So I think there is a background to going to the court. So I think that needs to be also looked at. So that's why the legal challenge, they are threatening both sides that they will mount a legal challenge. The only way that we can get out of this legal challenge is if one of them gets a clear majority, that is, crosses 270 and maybe reaches 270. But I don't know whether that's feasible, because given the very close margins, etc., and the figures that are coming, I am not sure whether one of them will actually cross it decisively, that benchmark of 270. And what could be difficult would be if they are tied in terms of Electoral College. I think the Electoral College is 548 or something. And so that's why 270 is the figure.
Yes.
I'm not sure the exact number, but 270 is just over half the number, I think. Just one seat more than half the number. So I think this is the problem now. And now that they have gone into this counting, etc., I doubt very much that any court is going to stop the counting because of the precedent, the legal precedents that have been established, that you have to count the votes that have come in. Now, even Mike Pence, the vice president, when he, after President Trump had spoken, said that every vote counts. This is something that he said, and every vote in a democracy counts. Democracy is built on this, and the counting will go on. So I don't know whether he was contradicting Trump or whether he was making a point that how can we stop counting? So I don't know what is really happening now. I think the latest results will give us perhaps another look at which way it's heading. But it's down to the wire now because of these 4 or 5 states that need to be locked in by one party or the other.
Yes, but like you said, a lot of this may not happen if there is a clear win one side or the other. But Smita, that's also the other point, right? There is a possibility, and now a bigger possibility than earlier, that Donald Trump's not going to accept that and say, well, I told you there is a mail ballot fraud and this is why the numbers have changed. I told you on 3rd I was doing well, I was winning all of these states, and now the numbers have changed because it's a mail ballot fraud.
Tanvi, I think a lot of these answers actually lie in Donald Trump's personality itself. And the more you read the definitive biographies, the autobiographies of the Donald Trump, the man, who built those real estate empires, the multi-billion-dollar industry, it amazes you. I mean, this one person who knew how to turn around bad debts. I mean, in the 90s, if you see the way, there was a point in time when there was an entire phase where just a week after week, either his casinos would be on the verge of bankruptcy, his airlines would be on the verge of bankruptcy, his hotels and other businesses would be so. And every time, where he would go in for more borrowings, make some excuses, it would end up that he had actually taken, say, $10 million of borrowings from some banks, and for all you know, he was spending out $8 million in providing alimony or buying a extremely piece of expensive piece of jewelry for one of his wives. So that is Donald Trump for you. He's not somebody who accepts defeat easily. He's like one of those spoiled children who would rather completely overturn the board of Ludo or chess if they think that they were losing that game. And the very fact that he has gone out there, on the one hand, if he is actually so confident that he is going to win these elections, then fair enough. Let the votes be counted. Let the votes speak for themselves. But clearly he knows that this is going to be a neck and neck position, or maybe a wafer-thin majority for Joe Biden, in which case he could actually cast more doubts and aspersions on these votes. I mean, the voting counting system that you're talking about, they are different. Florida, Ohio, they actually count the absentee votes first. But if you look at Michigan, Pennsylvania, or even Wisconsin, they do it the other way around. They don't count till the election day. So there are, of course, some systemic issues and complexities around the election process that Donald Trump, unfortunately, despite leading this democracy that preaches democratic values and conduct of elections to other countries, he is in fact going into, trying to disrupt the entire process and delegitimize the votes of the citizens of America.
Yes, which is why if you see, a lot of people are just simply emphasizing that each and every vote needs to be counted. That is every citizen's right. You cannot take it away from them, and once they have cast their vote, that has to be counted. But from every single indication that we are looking at, Vinay, is Donald Trump's attempt to not let that happen, because there's also been so much conversation that a lot of the mail-in ballots are probably coming in from the Democrat supporters. And as they get counted, it just becomes more and more difficult for Donald Trump to get re-elected.
That's right. And that's principally, again, because the Democrats, led by, of course, Joe Biden, were leading the campaign on how Trump has been violating every single COVID norm, right? I mean, his whole public campaign strategy, his jet setting, his refusal to wear masks, him, running away from the hospital, appearing in public. Obviously, the Democrats weren't following that, led by Joe Biden. In fact, there is, currently, if you hear the US network, some of them are discussing whether the Democrats missed a trick there and they should have campaigned a little bit more than they actually did. And possibly not have certain states going so close. I mean, there is some bit of talk that the experts there are, currently undergoing. So yes, I mean, obviously the postal ballots were heavily loaded in favor of the Democrats. That was almost certain. Most experts were actually pointing towards that. And now, there was also a lot of talk about this so-called shy Trump voter. Now, I don't know whether a shy Trump voter exists or doesn't exist, but the American media seems to be talking a lot about that and whether that is going to play a role or not. So, yes, I mean, there is definitely that angle. And there is, of course, another angle of the judiciary and how it's very different from India, which we can, of course, discuss a little later.
Yes, in fact, since you brought that up, let's talk a little bit about that as well. Mr. Chakravarti, if you can come in on that aspect. If this does reach the Supreme Court, is there any past example, historic precedent of then what happens? How long could it take? Until then, who's going to be US's president?
Well, I'm not very sure about what is the past precedent. But there is one precedent that I know, which was, I quoted that to you, about Pennsylvania county, which didn't go either way because it was a tied vote among the judges. So I think then what happened was when it is tied, then the law says that Pennsylvania can go ahead with its time schedule. Now, I don't know whether this will be challenged. Don't forget that Trump now has a majority in terms of his appointees in the Supreme Court. And it could then perhaps go Trump's way. I mean, they could pass a judgment saying that what Trump is demanding is right, that you have to stop this counting after the election day is over. And why didn't you count it, on the election day and finish it? Now, these kind of issues can rise. How the judges will look at it, I really can't say. I mean, it's very difficult at this stage to really predict what is going to happen at the court.
Yes, Vinay, so again, even in that case, they work very differently than our Supreme Court does, and there is always a big political fight about who gets nominated to the Supreme Court. And Trump has managed to put in now 3 Republicans in his last term.
Yes, and again, for viewers who are not familiar with the systems in the United States, their judiciary works significantly differently from ours. And in fact, they are very overt about certain things. One thing you mentioned about him being able to nominate 3 of his own judges. Now, they have a system in their constitution. There is something called an Article 3 appointee. Once the Senate confirms the appointment, those judges serve for life.
Yeah.
They can actually be a judge forever. Now, that, and not just that, here, if you see in the United States, the discourse is fairly open about whether a judge is a liberal or a conservative, or whether the judge leans towards the right or doesn't lean towards the right. I mean, they speak about that very openly. In India, you cannot do that. I mean, you will be probably hauled up for contempt if you start talking like that about judges. So we are at least overtly very insulated from all of this. But their judiciary isn't. That's a very open discourse. And that's why a lot of people believe that Mr. Trump's having been able to insert some of his own judges, especially with the Amy Coney Barrett appointment that happened, it might just give him a bit of an advantage. And this advantage is being openly talked about, which is very unusual from what you see in India, and also the process of judicial appointments that we have. I mean, their appointments, the president enjoys quite a lot of role, and of course the Senate has to confirm that. But once that happens, there is definitely a role that they end up playing.
Smita, what's your sense, is that where it's now going to play out in the United States Supreme Court, or could it actually, I mean, I know it's very difficult to predict Donald Trump, or could it be one of his empty threats?
No, it's not an empty threat. You know, the one thing that I've realized about Donald Trump is that what he says, he puts his money where his mouth is. Whether you like it, hate it, you cannot ignore it. And it's been true with all his election, in fact, promises that he made during the campaign leading up to the 2016 polls. And many of us were skeptical about it then. And we, just thought that, perhaps, this is just about campaign rallies. Once he's into power, once he's into the administration, there will be sufficient checks and balances or the institutional processes. But you did see that he actually went out there and did what he wanted to do, be it on the Iran nuclear deal, be it on the climate change agreement, be it, of course, on throwing the baby with the bathwater when it comes to World Health Organization in some way, talking about, defunding it, things like that. So he has stayed true to his promises that he has made to his core constituency. So in Supreme Court, of course, as Vinay mentioned, I mean, it's a 6:3 conservative leaning, in fact, bench that we are talking about. So 6 justices who are looked upon as conservative with Republican leanings and orientations. And the Republican supporters have been in some sort of a way drawing solace. But, whether it is just limited to Supreme Court, whether it's just limited to one federal lawsuit, the very beauty of America lies in its federal structure, in its federalism that it takes a lot of pride in. But it's also that federal structure that is leading to all these election day complications with every state with so much of powers. So it could lead into protracted complications as far as the state legislatures is concerned. Any of the state legislatures could file any number of suits in the Supreme Court or in other of the state courts, and which is why, in fact, this time, unlike in the past, you see both Democrats and Republicans actually prepared with an entire battery of lawyers, something they have been talking now for days at a stretch, which is why Donald Trump's tone and tenor of his, declaring victory even before the race was called by others may have been shocking, and also because it did imply in a lot of ways a dog whistle to his supporters to sort of fan some sort of unrest. And those pictures that we have seen in the last few days of Republican supporters literally oiling their guns in Michigan, they are very disturbing pictures. But it's something that Donald Trump has calculated. It is not something that he's just decided to do on election night itself.
Oh, no, absolutely not. We've seen gun sales soaring in many parts of the country in the last few weeks. We've seen many concerning comments being made by Donald Trump himself when he turns up and says, well, if you're going to take too long to count the votes and declare the results, then bad things are going to happen, which are going to lead to very bad things. I mean, it's his classic style of making a comment, but I think it was pretty clear of what he's insinuating. And again, in their in the way it is in US, they're very open, even when they are talking about possible unrest and preparations for that. Mr. Sanjay Kapoor, there are visuals of even the White House being boarded up. That many says perhaps the wall that Trump always spoke about, but it didn't happen at the Mexican border. It happened right outside White House. What's your own sense? Does that fear or that threat still loom large of unrest?
I think it's very probable that something like that could happen, because US has been preparing for a showdown for a while. People have been buying the guns from the malls and shopping stores and just beefing themselves up, and they're trying to see that when things don't go the way that Mr. Trump is expecting, he will unleash his white supremacists who are, as Smita pointed out, oiling their guns and preparing to ensure that so-called the movement that was created, Black Lives Matters, and the other one, Antifa, do not really, put the entire white expectations or aspirations on the defensive. So I'm quite fearful something like that would happen, because in my conversation with many of those people who are supporters of Republican, they made it amply clear that if things don't happen, then prepare for the worst. And I think they're preparing for the worst. There was an interview of Bernie Sanders some time back, and he said, he was very precise. He said very exactly that this is how things are going to play out. There would be a first round of voting, which will be counted, where Trump is going to declare that he is winning, and then he will step in and demand that the voting should be stopped, because the real voters would be of Democrats who will come in, and then he would bring in the pressure from the ground, and things might just spin out of control. So that is how it's been talked about again and again. So everything is actually taking place according to a certain script. So if this has happened, and I'm sure there could be violence, and the fear of violence is something that could drive out a lot of people out of business, as it is they're all reeling under pandemic, the stock market, although going yo-yo on some reason or the other. So we have to keep fingers crossed that just doesn't become extremely violent. And in the last few months, US has been witness to that kind of thing.
And I thought that in 2016 and in the months in the run-up to that election, the United States people and society had gotten highly polarized, but I think it's just got worse from there to now, and that's just going to add further fuel to this fire if at all there is any kind of unrest that takes place. One point that Mr. Chakravarti pointed out earlier, and I want to come back to that, is the issue of electoral votes. While a lot of this is happening, is the issue of electoral votes, and there's a long history about why they started it in the 1800s, why they thought at that point of time it was necessary, Mr. Chakravarti. But why have they not been able to get rid of it for the past 50 years at least? Many times this has been brought up. And in the recent times, more by the Democrats. Why have they not been able to change it?
The answer is that no consensus. And you need a consensus to change this law. And both sides don't agree. So this is what happens. I mean, in any democracy, that if you want to change such a fundamental law, then you need consensus among the opposing parties. And that has not happened. And Democrats have generally brought it up more often because they are the ones who have suffered at the hands of the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton is the example that I can again give. Earlier too, I think it had happened with George Bush and Walter Mondale. Not Mondale, but
Al Gore.
Anyway, it has happened to the Democrats that they won the popular vote, as we call it, the national vote. But in terms of Electoral College, they couldn't make it to past 270. So I think this is a peculiar system that the Americans have developed, And it has a history, it has a background too as to why it happened, after the Civil War and things like that. But it's up to them to change it, and it would be cleaner and a simpler system. You have a popular vote, and whoever wins that becomes the president. But I do not know why they haven't changed it. I suppose the Republicans see some advantage in it, and some states might be objecting, because I think all the states probably will have to agree, or at least the majority of them will have to agree to change this law.
Yes, in fact, Smita, that is one of the big problems, isn't it? That you will have to get all the states to change their systems and their laws, and then it just becomes a big fight about state versus federalism.
Not just states versus the federal structure, Tanvi. When the founding fathers of the American Constitution were debating the merits of the Electoral College system, and which in fact predates even that, the larger sentiment was that it should not become a case where the smaller states are neglected, where leaders just come in on the eve of elections and simply woo some of the larger states with a direct, in fact, number which could elect the leaders at the national level, which is why you have this extremely complicated system, which is a mixture somehow. If you look at our Lok Sabha elections, and then you combine the Rajya Sabha election process, and then add to it the presidential election system. So the three layers that we have in the parliamentary system of democracy in India, everything combined goes into the presidential form of election in the United States. And, of course, these arguments have come up whether they should be relooking or rethinking. But it's not just about the state versus the center. It's also about that you have to then hold sway over both the House of Representatives and the Senate to have enough numbers to bring in any such, in fact, constitutional amendments. And if anything at all over the last few years, though we have seen 2 terms of governments for, starting from Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, to, and now we don't know whether he'll get a second term or not. But these numbers will also be very difficult to get, because even the political parties, if you look at the multi-party system, never really evolved in the United States. It's always been a 2-party system. Even if you look at the Republicans and the Democrats, the number of voices that were actually centrist, that could build on national consensus on foreign policy, on economic policy in the past, be it Republicans in the Reagan administration, or today, if you're talking about, these things have become very difficult. We are looking at a polarized American society, fractious political systems, the Lincoln Project, where a lot of the Republican supporters were actually going out there and batting so that people would not vote in favor of Donald Trump. So with these kind of differences that you're looking at, and also with the rise of the right across the world, the questions about liberals, whether we are living in echo chambers or not, what is going wrong with the liberal messaging, this has definitely left so much to be healed as far as America is concerned, that the question of any major constitutional amendment like doing away with the Electoral College, I don't think it is possible anytime in near future.
Fair enough. I agree with you, and especially in times like these, which are highly polarized, probably there will not be it will be very difficult to arrive at any consensus about that kind of a system. But it does get problematic, and at some point maybe people will understand that. Of course, an argument that was mentioned earlier, an argument that's often given is to say, well, in 150 years, if the presidential elections held there have only been a handful of times that the electoral votes have been different from the popular votes. And so perhaps that's the argument to say, then why change it, Vinay?
Yeah, but look, ironically, the genesis of coming up with the system actually lies in the abhorrent practice of slavery.
Yes.
And also racism.
Yes.
Because obviously the makers then didn't want, they actually assumed that people vote according to their own individual volition and not according to party norms, as it so turned out later on, because people do vote on party lines and not by their own instinct itself. But they didn't want those people to have that particular power. And that's why there was this middle ground system where somebody else takes the call on behalf of you. So it's an abhorrent. But, from an outside America perspective, I'm being in India, I'm not an expert in America, I don't live there. I can tell you what I seriously do believe, and I'm sure Sanjay and Mr. Chakrabarti and Smita will have a view on that. I sincerely do believe that the messier this process is this year, the more it will reduce the moral authority that the US has acquired on itself of being the pulpit talker about democracy across the world. I mean, they've routinely commented about elections in Africa. They keep telling rest of the world countries on how to conduct elections, but they're not making a very good advertisement of themselves, especially if there is a social unrest, or if there's violence, or if the courts intervene, it becomes messy. They're not going to look like the moral preachers that they seem to have believed about more democracy. I mean, I again mentioned this point. I do believe that if you really compare India, which is the largest democracy size-wise, seems to be a much better role model and example, because all said and done, we've had examples like mayhem in the 80s where we just went around capturing booth and stuffing ballot papers, but we never really had a problem on counting. We've had problems in polling. But once polling is over and counting begins, it's fairly smooth. Even in the era of polling ballot papers, our counting processes were by and large smooth. So we hold up as a better example of democracy than, of course, the United States, which seems to just appropriate that role for itself. And I have a feeling that moral authority will reduce if this becomes messy.
Mr. Sanjay Kapoor, is there a possibility that somebody asks for a recount in any of these states where the numbers come down really close? Because I'm just wondering that if there are lakhs of paper ballots to be counted, can somebody ask for a recount, and then what happens?
First of all, I want to tell Vinay that he has a long memory. He mentioned mayhem. I was there when the stuffing of votes was taking place. I was thrown out from a polling booth, but they were all pre-EVM days and things were very different. But coming to this business of recount, every state has a different way of doing it. I mean, there are states where till the time there's a difference about 1%, recount is not suggested. So this is not going to be easy. And on top of that, we've seen it in Florida. There was a recount and, the difference kept on going up and down. They could not actually come to zero down on an exact figure, Every time they counted, they found that there was a difference. Till the time there was an intervention from the court and, or at least Mr. Al Gore decided to say that, he'll concede. So I think it's all mired in a kind of confusion that we cannot really fathom. People are building all kinds of scenario that if it becomes 269 to 269, what really happens? It will go to the House of Representatives, where the vote will take place sometime in January. Or in between, if you have a situation where you have the Supreme Court stepping in, because the high courts cannot really look into it, and because there's so many high courts involved in each of the state, the matter will go to the Supreme Court. How much time will they take? What will they really do? So it's a democracy at work. Vinay has said that, we may not agree, that we'll think that it's all very messy. But you look at it, every institution of the United States of America is being asked to, step up and deliver on some count or the other. And they are all being tested on the ground and by globally. So it's a very interesting situation. And as I said earlier, everybody expected that this is going to happen. And they had deep, although there were polls which are conducted, 538, another Nate Silver said that is going to be, a landslide for Biden, but it will go to the wire. And so others also said. But you look at the statements coming out from Bernie Sanders, or for that matter, Donald Trump, that, the entire thing will play out like this. And it is exactly how it is being done. So let's see what really happens. The recount is going to complicate matters further.
Well, there is one clip, and I'm sure all of you by now have seen it, of Bernie Sanders, an interview that he gave a few days ago, and it's literally coming true to the word from him predicting the states where there will be a delay and the extent of delay in each of these states, including Pennsylvania, from him predicting that Donald Trump is going to stand up at a particular hour on election day and make claims about election fraud, and all of it is going to boil down to then a fight about the mail ballots, which the Democrats would have used more and would end up tilting some of the numbers in states in their favor if the counting went on. So Donald Trump won't want that counting to happen. All of it was said, and I think that clip's just now come back for everybody to watch and say, okay, so this is possible. It may seem chaotic and confusing to a lot of people, but for the experts on US elections and those who've watched and followed Donald Trump closely, it all makes sense. They kind of saw this coming. I just want to add this as I thank our panelists for joining us on this conversation and really breaking it down for us. We don't know when there will be clarity on who the next US president will be, but we do know that it's going to take many hours, if not many days or weeks. Let me just give you one example, viewers, of just how complicated it is, because each state in United States has a different set of rules. If you just look at the set of rules that were defined simply for postal ballots, for you to not come out during times of a pandemic and actually mail your vote, those rules were widely different from one state to the other. So, for example, in Alaska, they said that the postmarked ballots are allowed till November 13th. California said that the postmarked ballots are allowed as late as November 20th. District of Columbia, postmarked ballots were allowed till November 13th. Illinois had a completely different date. When these ballots will be counted, when the counting will start for them, that date was also different for many states, and which is why we saw in some of the cases that ended up in courts already. Before the election day, there were fights in various courts of United States. In Pennsylvania, there was a battle about it. In North Carolina, there was a court fight about it between Democrats who supported extending the deadline for absentee ballots and the Republicans who opposed it, and the court finally ruled saying a 6-day extension will be given. In Minnesota, Texas, Nevada, there have already been court cases this election season. That's how different each state treats it and has its own set of rules. But somehow it still all comes together for the United States of America to choose and elect their next president. Let's wait and watch what happens next. Thank you so much for joining us on this special broadcast. Good evening and welcome to the 9 p.m. edition of the Urban Debate. It is 9 p.m. here in India. It's the next morning there in United States after election day and night, and they still don't know who's going to be their next US president. So over the next 1 hour, we're going to break it down for you. We're going to tell you the latest updates. Where is the delay? What is the controversy or the confrontational points? And when possibly can we know who the next US president is going to be? I have a panel of experts who will be joining us to take you through all of these aspects and clear your confusion. Let me just first begin by telling you this. Various networks are projecting various numbers from 224 to 238 for Joe Biden in terms of electoral votes, and Donald Trump a little behind him at about 213. The winner needs to have 270 electoral votes. What are electoral college votes? I'm going to explain that to you also on this broadcast, but I want to just read out what Donald Trump has just tweeted. Just 10 minutes ago, President Trump has tweeted saying, "How come every time they count mail-in ballot dumps, they are so devastating in their percentage and power of destruction?" This is going to be a key focus tonight, viewers. Donald Trump very openly now pushing for results to be declared without having all mail ballots being counted, because there is a concern that as more and more of these paper ballots are counted, there will be more in favor of Democrats, that more Democrats in America chose the mail-in ballot form while Republicans chose to come out on the streets, physically go and cast their vote. And perhaps which is why Donald Trump is pushing for the declaration of result before all votes are counted. But that would be a tragedy in any democracy across the world. First up, let's go across to Vinay Tiwari. Vinay, for a lot of states, it is now clear who they have chosen. All of this comes together to have a final name. But there are a few states that have left us hanging. The swing states, battleground states. Take us through those details.
Yes, and we've spent the bulk of the day telling our viewers how different US democracy is from India. Let's look at something that may be a little similar. If I was to give a slightly crude equivalent for everyone to easily understand, the states that I'm going to be talking about right now are a lot like, say, UP, Bihar, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal of India, because these are states whose electoral outcomes determine who's going to be the next president of the United States. And the top of the pile of the list, that the states that everybody looks at very keenly, is Pennsylvania. A big swing state, 20 electoral votes, so it's very, very significant. The counting process still, of course, on. Nobody has yet won that. And look at what's happening there currently. Donald Trump, 54.7 percentage of votes so far. Whereas Biden is trailing with 43.9%, just a shade under 44% votes. So that's what's happening in Pennsylvania. Now let's go to the other big state where there is still a suspense and nobody knows which way it will go. Wisconsin, 10 electoral votes. Again, very, very tight contest. It's less than a percent difference between the two. 49.5% for Joe Biden and 48.8% for Trump. It cannot get closer than that. And if you see the vote count here, the difference is in thousands. And this is as close an election and as divided an election as you could imagine. So Wisconsin, one state that people are looking at. North Carolina, the next on the screens that you'll see in a second, is the other state that everybody's looking at very, very carefully. 15 electoral votes, so fairly significant in terms of size. Here again, neck and neck battle, 50.1% for Donald Trump as of now and 48.7% for Joe Biden. And again, if you see, the difference between the votes is barely in thousands. So again, a state that can go either way and something that everybody is almost anticipating with bated breath on what will really happen. Next big state, everybody who's looking at it, it's been one state that everybody's talked about it all through the elections, Michigan, 16 electoral votes. Yet again, look at the difference, 0.2%. It cannot get closer than that. I mean, just imagine how close it is. Less than 10,000 votes separating the two principal candidates. And this is as dramatic a finishing. So this is the biggest, if you had any nails left, if you're living in this state, possibly you must be the luckiest person alive, because you really cannot have, a bigger suspense than that. So after Michigan, the next most critical state is Georgia. The state where some of the US's top, the news networks are located. CNN is located in Georgia and Atlanta. 16 electoral college votes, significant in terms of size. And again, a neck and neck election. Trump is leading there, but very thin margin, 50.5% as opposed to Biden's 48.3%. And remember, Georgia was also one of the states which saw a lot of violence in the run-up to the elections and a lot of unrest, when the action was taken by the police and Black Lives Matter movement happened quite a lot in that part of the world as well.
Yes, absolutely, and which is why these are the states which will be very important to track. Now, as Vinay was telling us how, close the contest is in these states, it's also important to understand the kind of weightage that they have, which is what he also pointed out. All states have different weightage, which gets reflected in the number of electoral votes that they account for. Put together for all states of United States, that comes to about 540, 270 is the number that anybody needs to win the US elections. Of these 5 pending ones, where it's still not clear, it's a toss-up, as they say, and it isn't clear if the Democrats are going to win this state or the Republicans. Of these 5, the one with the largest number of electoral college votes is Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania has 20 electoral college votes. In Pennsylvania, the counting for the mail-in ballots started extremely late. And they have a large percentage of votes yet to be counted. If you look at the data on your screen, just so far, 77% of the votes have been counted. So they have a long way to go. And that is probably going to be the state that leaves us hanging till the end if the contest gets really close. That's one of the key states to watch out for. Let's say good evening to the panelists who are joining us right now. Shubhajit Roy, Associate Editor for the Indian Express, Narayan Lakshman, Associate Editor and former US Correspondent for The Hindu, and Professor Harshvi Pant, Director for Studies and Head of Strategic Studies Program at ORF. In fact, let me start off with Professor Pant on the comment that's just been made and the Twitter series of tweets that Donald Trump is putting out. Mr. Pant, are you surprised that already the conversation has begun and allegations have begun as far as the mail-in ballots are concerned by Donald Trump?
Not really, because he has been talking about this issue for quite some time, and it was clear that he would bring it up at some point. But I do think that this has been quite an extraordinary day for Donald Trump. because he has clearly outperformed what most opinion polls were telling us till the other day. And he has outperformed, like according to some of the recent data, he has done well with every single category of voters in America except white working men. So it's very interesting, that he seems to have added to his vote base, except the white men, which was supposed to be score base, where he seems to have lost to some points, whatever whatever data is available at this point. But as you were pointing out, it comes down to the wire in these states, and he knows that he has to take on he has to win in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is critical for whoever is winning, and both sides actually have positioned themselves around Pennsylvania in their statements, in the public statements. If you recall last night, in America last night, when Joe Biden came to the podium, he said, "Look, we are going to fight till the last ballot is counted." And Mr. Trump came to podium and he said, "Well, we are going to see if we can take it to the Supreme Court." So both sides are positioning themselves around what happens in Pennsylvania if the rest of the remaining states could not possibly decide could not make any one contender reach 270. But I don't think this is surprising what is happening. I think it was Mr. Trump has given every indication that he would take it to the wire, that he would make it, he would take it to the courts, and that the ballot, postal ballot, early balloting was something that he felt did not do justice for whatever reasons he thinks fit, and therefore that needs to be questioned. And I think he will do that irrespective.
He will do that irrespective. He says, "Last night I was leading, often solidly, in many key states, in almost all instances, Democrat-run and controlled states. Then one by one, they started to magically disappear as surprise ballot dumps were counted. Very strange, and pollsters got it completely and historically wrong." By the way, this tweet has also been marked by Twitter to say this may contain some certain misleading information. And after that, it's just one tweet after the other. So Donald Trump has had his share of rest, and he is back now to the social media platform to make his stand very clear. So Shubhajit, what are the states that he's essentially talking about where the change is happening and is perhaps further expected to widen?
Well, I mean, Pennsylvania, as you pointed out earlier, that 77% votes have already been sort of reported, as New York Times puts it. And Trump is ahead by 10 points. I mean, that's a pretty decent margin for him to keep if he is able to maintain that. The other states that he's ahead are North Carolina and Georgia, but very small point, less than 2 points in Georgia, North Carolina, 1.4. Biden, on the other hand, in Michigan and Nevada, he's ahead by 0.2%, 0.6%. So, the margins are really slim. So this sort of rhetoric that's coming out from both sides that they will challenge if the others, if this slim margin continues and go for a legal recourse, this was expected, and this is something that we've talked about earlier, yes, last night as well. And this slim margin opens the possibility of not just legal challenge, but also violence, prospects of violence on the streets. And we saw pictures earlier of boarded up storefronts in Manhattan. And I think that gives you a sense of how close and how volatile this election's outcome is going to be.
But I'm just trying to understand that, and Narayan, maybe you can come in on this. For many, it will be difficult to accept that here is the leader of what they claim the best and the free and the biggest democracy, who's saying that we shouldn't be counting these votes, that people who've chosen this route, their votes shouldn't matter. He's alleging fraud. But how can we have a system where millions of such paper ballots are discounted and we announce a winner?
No, absolutely. You've highlighted one of possibly the biggest flaws in this wonderfully touted democratic model, which is that, what we've seen today is a anti-democratic, it is a borderline or actual authoritarian conduct to say that legally valid votes cast should not be counted. That is an act of authoritarian government. And the reason is quite interesting, is that there is, for all the very, very complex phraseology within the US Constitution, the one thing that it does not make compulsory is for the loser of a general presidential election to have or to hold a concession speech. That is a speech where they accept there's a statement of defeat, they celebrate democracy, they praise the voting, they congratulate the winner, and they vow to fight on. So this is not required, and it is actually by tapping into this sort of loophole that President Trump, let's say in the hypothetical scenario of him losing because of these close margins, is able to instead divert the attention entirely within the constitutional framework into some other avenue. It could be a lawsuit filed which reaches the Supreme Court, which is now, of course, packed 6-3 in favor of conservatives, thanks to 3 judges that he has appointed there. Or it could be a far more complex maneuver involving Congress, maybe the Federal Election Commission and others, where they do what is called a contingent election. Now, normally a contingent election is only done when you have 269 votes each and it's a tie. But there are all sorts of sort of behind doors maneuvers possible. And the reason, as I said, for that is there is no firm constitutional requirement for the loser in an election to give a concession, a public concession. So this is why now the door is literally opened to a very, very messy conclusion from what began as a fairly smooth election and voting process yesterday.
So what does that mean then? Are we staring at a situation where this simply ends up in the Supreme Court and we don't know who the winner is for weeks together?
Absolutely, absolutely. This could carry on, as you saw in the 2000 election. There was a challenge to the recount that was happening, and the Supreme Court stopped a recount, and that was a ruling in favor of George W. Bush. And that ruling literally came 1 month after the election. So hypothetically speaking, we are looking at a much longer delay, days, weeks, possibly even up to a month, even when the counting is actually finished.
Okay, Mr. Pant, if I can come to you. And you're right, in many of the states that we have where the results have already been called, Donald Trump has performed much better than he even did the last time around. He's definitely performed much better than what some of the pollsters were suggesting. But in the 4 of the 5 states which are still pending, is there a possibility for him to still wing this in his favor without getting into a battle about mail-in ballots?
I think so, and I think that's why you see some of his, even some of the Republicans have questioned his approach to, his speech. For example, his very close advisor Chris Christie was saying it's a bad strategy to challenge them, to challenge the process at this stage, because Mr. Trump has done well. He's still doing well. The kind of the kind of numbers that are coming out of Pennsylvania, still it's a huge margin. It's possible to be overturned, and it's possible to go either way. In both these, in all these battleground states. But if you look at the numbers, they are quite they tell you a different story compared to what we were hearing till yesterday. From pollsters, from media, I think there has been an undercurrent, and Mr. Trump actually has been more right than the media on the shy voter phenomena, on how people are going to vote. So there is something clearly happening in America that people are not getting, and the pollsters did not really capture. So his approach here to go on the offensive, I think, signifies or underscores as much about his personality as anything else, because clearly, he can play it either way at this stage, and it's not entirely evident that by going on the offensive, he will be able to manage it better. But this is what he does every time he sees that he might lose, and hopefully he's hoping that he might be hoping. I think that this would allay some of the concerns amongst his base, and perhaps also unnerving the opponent, and in this case Joe Biden. That if this is going to be a long haul, then Joe Biden and his team will also be prepared with their legalese and with their battery of lawyers. But clearly, I think at this stage, at this point, we still have to wait for a few hours to see how the returns come from some of these crucial states which are still counting, and where every single vote would matter in deciding who actually gets the electoral college votes. And the difference, as your report was earlier pointing out, is 1% here, is 0.1% here, 0.2% there, and it's clearly changing rapidly. But what is, I think, from Mr. Trump's perspective, the challenge might be that as he has put it, the early ballots, the postal ballots, are all perhaps tinted in blue, as the assumption is that these are all Democratic voters. So perhaps he does not foresee his support extending down over the next few hours, or his opponents' support declining. So I think that is the challenge that he faces, and therefore he has taken this political stand of challenging it, at this point. And I would also like to add that I don't think this would land automatically in the Supreme Court. There is no way in which a question which is at the level of state legislatures automatically lands in a Supreme Court. First, it will go to the local court. So if there is a problem in Pennsylvania, it will have to go to the district court there, and then it will go, if they are not able to resolve it, goes to the Supreme Court.
Okay, but we are, I just want to highlight the fact, and Narayan, maybe you or Shubhajit can come in more on this. The contest is already in many courts. And I was just reading about it. For example, North Carolina has already seen a court fight between the Democrats who wanted an extension in the deadline for absentee votes and the Republicans who were opposing it, but a 6-day extension was given. In Minnesota, late arriving ballots are being segregated from the rest of the vote because there is an ongoing litigation under a federal appeal court order. In Nevada and in Texas, also appeals were filed, and the Republicans attempted to stop them from postal ballots, using them and counting them. Vinay, you wanted to comment?
Just before you ask for an answer, because that's linked to what they're saying.
Yeah.
Kathy Bookwar, who carries the designation of the Pennsylvania Secretary of State, has just begun addressing a press conference to explain what's happening with the vote count in Pennsylvania. Now, they're doing that right in the middle of it, in fact, right at the start of it. And that's she just started talking, so we don't know what she's saying, but obviously that she's coming out and explaining things are happening in Pennsylvania, one state that all our panelists and experts have spoken about.
Yes, absolutely. And that's going to be a very big one. They have 20 electoral college votes, and also perhaps the one where a legal battle will be fought. So essentially my point being, Narayan, that there are already cases in various courts across United States. Will we still see them being fought in the local courts first before it goes to US Supreme Court?
No, I totally think that is the case, and I agree with Harsh there that's going to happen. But again, there's some issues there. So firstly, let's be clear on the facts. The actual statistical probability of mail-in vote fraud, the Brennan Justice Center has published several reports on it, is well below 1%. You're looking at something of 0.0004 to 9%. And so it is completely unfounded in that sense. And basically, in this election, that translates to the fact that you're not able to find any mail fraud. While you're absolutely right to say there are many litigations kind of working their way through the state courts, and in fact, Republican state administrations have worked furiously to sort of scupper the process of online balloting, mail balloting, absentee voting, all of it, because like Mr. Trump, they've taken their signal from him. They believe that it will not be in his favor. There has not been any actual cases of, let's say, large case of ballots favoring Republicans being found in a dumpster somewhere. So only when you see those kinds of things, or you have the Election Commission conducting some kind of a sweep or a raid somewhere and finding stashed ballots. So when you have that, only then can you actually take anything to a local court or the Supreme Court. So one question I would have for Mr. Trump, if I could pose it, is what exactly are you going to be filing in the Supreme Court? Because to simply say postal ballots are illegal or subject to mail fraud does not stand up to empirical and statistical scrutiny.
Well, it's very difficult to get precise answers from the US president on anything. It's a lot about what he has to say for his supporters and backers to believe in and get convinced about. And I think many of them are convinced that mail ballots or postal ballots could lead to a large fraud, which is perhaps why, Shubhajit, a lot of the Republican supporters actually turned up to physically vote.
Yeah, and it was not surprising at all because the Democrats had put all the energies, a lot of the energies in getting their voters, their supporters to cast their votes through the postal ballots. And their mobilization was targeted at that strategy because they knew very well, fully well, that Republicans would turn up on the election day to vote at the countings, at the polling centers. Now, Trump knows this very well. He knew this from the start, that initial vote counting would possibly favor him when the votes for the election day ballots are counted. And only later, when the postal ballots are opened, that is when the scenario changes and the win will slip away from his hands and move towards Biden. I think he was well aware of that, and his today morning when he spoke about, which is late night in the US, when he spoke about stopping of the counting of the ballots, he was making a political rhetoric that was possibly planned from before, that he wanted to make a case that the ballots, the postal ballots, are fraudulent. As Narayan pointed out, it is sub-zero. I mean, the sub 1% of less than 1% of votes are said to be found to be fraudulent. Even if one can assume it goes up to 1%, even then the Democrats would have an upper hand because almost remember, to give an Indian context, about 10 crore voters out of 20 crore, 22, 23 crore voters have cast their vote. Almost half of them have cast their vote through postal ballots, which is the 10 crore is population of Bihar, from Indian context. So that many people have cast their votes through postal ballots who are primarily Democratic voters. So when if he moves Pennsylvania courts, state-wise courts, or other states, he is sort of itching for a legal challenge, which will take to the courts at the state level, and then at the later stage, it can be adjudicated at the Supreme Court, which he is packed in with his conservative judges, as we know with the latest judicial appointment. So he has carefully built up the scenario to create confusion, and I think we would have to wait. Now, the only thing, that deadline before us is that the US federal law says that in December, all the electors will have to meet to elect the president. Now, that is the deadline from a month from now. Before that, we will see a lot of legal battles, whether state or Supreme Court, to decide the fate of this election and come at the arrive at the outcome after the votes are counted.
Okay, so that brings us to another crucial point, and we were talking about it earlier as well. When it comes down to the US Supreme Court, and perhaps that's what Donald Trump is counting on, is the mix of the justices. Of the 9, a larger percentage, a majority of them are Republican nominees.
Oh yes, and that's the one big difference that exists between how judiciary works in the United States and how it works here. There, the so-called leanings of judges are a very transparent, not transparent, but they're publicly part of public discourse. In India, it's unthinkable to actually have the leaning of a judge being discussed in public or even attributed to. I mean, that would be probably contempt of court. But there it's very obvious. I mean, a lot of people say this is a right-leaning judge or this is a left-leaning judge, he's a conservative judge or a liberal judge. And that does make a difference. Also remember that Article 3 of their constitution, which has which provides for, if once the Senate confirms the nominee of the president, the person serves for life. And that has a huge reason why presidents take so much of interest in who's going to be occupying not just the Supreme Court, but also even in the federal states. And that's why Mr. Trump had a bit of stroke of luck, because he got an opportunity to put his nominee just 3 to 4 days ahead of this process.
Which was widely opposed and contested by the Democrats, obviously because they didn't want another Republican nominee on the bench.
Yes, and that's why there is already a talk of the so-called conservative-leaning judges being now part of the panel that will possibly possibly be sitting in adjudication in case it goes to them for an adjudication process.
You know, and the point that you made, and I don't know if a lot of our viewers and Indians are aware of this, that unlike our Supreme Court, where the justices have a certain tenure before they retire, the Chief Justices, their tenure is extremely short. Like you pointed out, Vinay, in United States, these judges stay on for life.
That's right.
And so if you have a certain set who are more inclined towards one ideology versus the other, that's going to be impacting cases and policy for years together in a country. And that becomes obviously a big talking point.
Yes, and I'm sure some people, I mean, some of our viewers may have gotten a little bit of a hint of that. There's a movie that's been released recently, The Trial of Chicago 7, that gives you an idea. There have been allegations of the judiciary even being racist to the extent, because that particular judge who gave the judgment was openly accused in the United States, and it was a huge debate in those days about how this was racist. And that's not the kind of thing you see in India. I mean, for all our imperfections, there are certain things about institutions which don't become part of public discourse as it happens there. So whether it's good or bad, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that there is definitely a worry that people have currently about the way the judges might lean if it goes up for adjudication there.
Harshpant, what is your sense on if this case reaches Supreme Court? Are Republicans going to be more confident of a decision in their favor?
Yes, absolutely. I think that is beside the point. I'm sure Mr. Trump knows this and he's playing to it. I think at times the issue for Mr. Trump and for his supporters, especially in this case for Mr. Trump, is that he is positioning himself politically in a manner in which he is signaling to his base what his priorities are. And in a sense, what has also happened is that at this point in time, his base in particular, if you see the numbers, if you see how he has performed, would be much more willing to listen to him than to other interlocutors. In any case, his base is very, very, devoted to him. But if he makes an argument that, look, I have stood up now twice. I have stood up what he calls establishment. I have given, this country a mandate in 2016. I got this mandate. And now again, I'm very close to this mandate, despite all the doomsayers, despite all the that I'm going to fall apart. I've stood up and I've given you a resounding mandate. I'm on the cusp of giving you a resounding mandate. And therefore, now politically, it is important for me to position myself as someone that is looking at this to safeguard your interest. And your interest is that I make a case to the country, to the nation, that there has to be a reckoning of postal ballots, that these can be problematic. And I will make a case to the larger nation that this is something that cannot continue and that has to be resolved in a limited period of time, and so on and so forth. So I think he has positioned himself in a manner where he's speaking, as he does always, to his base, to his supporters, and politically trying to make a case that there's no other way of resolving this apart from you listening to me and I responding to you. And I think that is, given in the context in which it is happening, that most of those who predicted either a Biden sweep or a very strong performance by Mr. Biden seems to have come to naught. This message becomes even more powerful. So I think politically he's on a strong wicket at this point. And clearly, I feel he would have played it in a different way, as some of his Republican supporters also are suggesting. But for him, because he feels that he has been vindicated time and time again in the past, this is a policy measure. This is a strategic communication aspect that he thinks works for him, and he's communicating that way. I don't think he's going to back down till the very last minute, unless something dramatic happens, unless Mr. Biden actually wins other battleground states and is a clear declared winner. Even in that case, I think there will be some issues with certain states like North Carolina, where again litigation is possible. But I think by and large, Mr. Trump is looking at the end game, and end game, if it comes down to that, as you point out, if it goes all the way to the Supreme Court through various courts down the ladder, he would feel very confident that he has now he has put in place a system that is likely to deliver in his favor. Again, justices often surprise when they deliver their verdict. It's not as if all justices have all the time delivered in a certain way.
Correct.
And that is to be pointed out, that when you reach that stage, you become independent of the president who elected you in some ways, and to attribute that somehow they are going to deliver on the dot the way Mr. Trump wants them to deliver is also a mistake.
Yes, no, I do agree with you on that specific aspect, because a lot of what they would have presided on and given a verdict on would have to do with other larger policies, policies where Republicans have a certain view and Democrats do. But this is a very different case. This is a case where essentially it will boil down to a fight or a contest about mail postal ballot fraud, and whether or not that happened, could have happened, and what's the evidence that's available for that, Narayan. And I think that's where it could get tough if enough evidence is not available. Mail ballots and postal ballots are not new. Have there been any instances in the past, even in US, where evidence was provided?
Yes, absolutely. There have been very rare instances. I'm not sure, but I think it was maybe in North Carolina. There was actually a consultant for a Republican candidate called Mark Harris, who was suspected and then investigated and found to be guilty of committing some form of mail fraud. But like I said earlier, and others have echoed, it fits into that sub 1% category of 0.0004 or 0.0009%. So by and large, it is completely, it's something that President Trump is going to have to work very hard to pull out literally like a rabbit out of a hat, like a magic trick, to prove that there is some mail fraud that happened. So far, he has not openly offered any evidence of it. He has only talked about, like you said earlier, and Harsh as well said, he's appealing to his base. He has been trying to sow the seeds of conflict and confusion about mail fraud, and that is why Twitter and Facebook have come down so hard on him. His tweet today about the Democrats trying to steal the election, within, I think it was literally less than 3 minutes, they slapped that fact check notice on his tweet. So there is a very, very clear understanding of what this president is trying to achieve. And on that, though, I think one of the bigger questions is, what is the bigger picture here for Trump and what is at stake? So you're talking about the Supreme Court. And, the Supreme Court right now actually has, out of the 9 justices, 5 of them have been nominated by presidents who lost the popular vote. 2 of them nominated by George W. Bush, who also lost the popular vote, and 3 of them now, including Judge Barrett, most recently, by President Trump. So in a sense, the kind of justice they are, in theory, meting out is not really representative of what the American people's expectation of justice is. So if you bear that in mind, it is actually quite disturbing if you think about what is going to happen if Trump wins this challenge. Let's say he does lose and then he is reinstated by the court or through a contingent election or something of that sort. He is basically going to intensify the agenda that his core base has been wanting him to achieve. So the first term his first term has been all about undoing all of the things that Barack Obama and indeed even George Bush built up before him. You talk about the Paris Climate Accord. You talk about, the deal with Iran. You talk about, he wants to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, healthcare, the seminal reform that Obama brought about. And he has been undoing all that brick by brick. If he wins this second term, it's going to be about taking that agenda so much further. He is going to, what is called the nativist philosophy. He is going to push the America First agenda much more. He is going to kind of clamp down on immigration as well as offshoring by American companies. And then we are going to have the real test to see whether Trumpism as such, as an ideology, works or not. But I think really these are the big questions that are going to come up as Trump goes about fighting this battle. Yes, the nitty-gritty is about the Supreme Court and all of that and mail fraud. But I think the bigger picture is what is truly disturbing a number of Democrats in the country.
And in fact, Trump supporters across the world would say truly disturbing Democrats and liberals across the world with what's happening, and even the way some of the results in the other states have panned out, contrary to what some of the pollsters were suggesting. So I want to come back to that point that Harsh Pant made right in the beginning. Shubhajit, do you believe that the pollsters did get it wrong in terms of how much support Trump did have in other states?
I would agree to the fact that the pollsters underestimated Trump's, appeal. That is clear from all the polls that we saw, barring one or two which were not said to be credible. Apart from that, most pollsters got it wrong. But we also have to see that the popular vote is still with Biden so far. The popular. So we'll have to see at the end of the day, state-wise, how things pan out. Because at the end of the day, the U.S. electoral system, the world's oldest democracy, has a flawed democratic process in that sense, in a classical sense. And what we are today seeing now is a reflection of that. These electoral colleges may not necessarily represent the popular vote that might be in favor of the other candidate. So that has been a challenge even while polling. Pollsters also encounter this particular flaw, this particular challenge in their polls, in their methodology. But having said that, I would take up on one point that the Harsh and I think Narayan also mentioned, that the courts, although they might have a conservative bias, doesn't always necessarily mean that they would rule in favor of the president. They don't always talk something which is pleasing to the president, that pleases the president. That is number one. And number two, the real concern is, even as the two campaigns approach the courts, the fear of law and order on the streets is something that we have to keep in mind. That is something that possibility is a real possibility. And that is something we have to see if Trump raises this political rhetoric as he's talking to his constituency, as Harsh pointed out earlier, that there is a possibility that the two sides might have a confrontational approach, not just in the courts, but also on the streets of America.
Vinay, you wanted to come in?
No, I just wanted to tease Shubhajit a little bit. Shubhajit and I used to be in the field together in the 90s, and we've both covered polling where we would prepare for sensitive cities and violence on the streets, and then prepare for a counting that would last 3 days. In good old Pragati Maidan, he possibly had covered counting that would never end, and we thought that system was flawed. And I don't think we would have imagined 22 years later we'll sit here and talk about the US democracy being so flawed. Well, it does appear that way because, I think we've smoothened out the systems dramatically. In that sense, it's fairly smooth. I mean, it's smooth and it's quick. And it's very ironical that United States is possibly the best export of United States is speed. I mean, from timed pizza deliveries to everything supersonic, speed is the biggest export of the United States.
They're the slowest when it comes to counting.
And they're the slowest when they actually count their votes. So, I mean, that's not a very good, messaging from the world's oldest democracy. I guess it's time they really look at this election and actually sit down and try and change this.
And as few of the states are infamous for the slow pace that they have, states like Maine and even their own experts find it difficult to figure why that happens. Shubhajit, sorry, go ahead.
No, Vinay, I think I would have just one comment to make. As someone pointed out the other day, that they have to now, like they outsource their work, their BPO to India, they have to outsource their election management to India as well now. That's the only way they can fix their this relatively 1/4 of India's voter size. Correct. If you really see 25 crore people voting, it is nothing for an Indian National Election Commission, the way they manage. So I think they have a lot of lessons to learn. So they should just outsource that to the Indian Election Commission.
Yeah, with 22 languages
let's
to
hope,
vote.
Let's hope Trump doesn't win and your outsourcing dream might not pan out.
For all the times that otherwise, people would have raised questions on EC's planning, including in the run-up to the Bihar elections, and if the rules that had been put in place would be safe enough. I think Election Commission is going to be very glad to hear what everybody has to say today about a few things that they can teach to United States. United States, like you were pointing out the other day, Vinay, doesn't even have an election commission.
Yeah.
So how do they go about it? Each state has its own
Yeah,
setup.
the precinct officers and the local civic body or the municipal, I mean, the closest equivalent I can think of, although I think the experts would correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the closest equivalent I can give. They're like the municipal officers we have here.
Right.
And they are the ones who actually go down and doing it. Of course, there are a lot of volunteers who get involved in it. They have a very large volunteer-based system that does help in the whole process from start to end.
So, in fact, if any of you can shed some more light on this, the fact that they don't have one body, one institution that organizes and coordinates this entire polling system, especially this time where it's so complicated because not only are a larger percentage of people using postal ballots, you also have the option of driving in and dropping off your ballot or physically turning up using the postal paper format or the electronic format. Who's organizing and coordinating it at a level across over 50 states?
Tanvi, it's actually down to each state government, but I must point out there is something called the Federal Election Commission, which is an independent regulatory authority. And however, its purpose is far more limited than what you see in the case of its equivalent in India, where it focuses entirely on campaign finance laws. And I mean, that is a very important aspect of elections, obviously, because you've seen actually tremendous back and forths. There was during Obama's term, in fact, when I was in the US, there was the Citizens United decision, which came from the Supreme Court, which basically allows political parties to tap into those, dark pools of corporate money with the sense of almost unaccountable, no paper trail kind of funds. And so the Federal Election Commission basically exists to kind of manage that process or to, where possible, regulate it. But there too, again, there's a push and pull from the private sector, and the private sector deals directly with the government through lobbyists. That's, again, a very unusual thing, which we don't see much of in India, at least not openly. We have more informal methods of that. But having said that, I think Americans pride themselves on the extent of power that they delegate to their states. While we also have a federal structure with state governments, we have the union list, state list, and concurrent list, but everything, I mean, the far more powers are delegated genuinely to the states there in terms of the framing of laws, in terms of, let's say even for the Second Amendment, the carrying of guns, there's concealed carry, there's all kinds of rules about that. Each state can do that, and as you can see, it has sometimes terrible consequences, and every other state has to live with that. So this is, while it has all its flaws and it affects the election too in terms of election rules, let's say, for Florida, for example, can say you can start counting mail ballots 22 days before voting day. And Colorado, for example, has been running mail-in voting for many, many years. It is a normal process. They are experts and they're one of the first states to come off the block with the results. But other states, like the ones we're seeing now in the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, they take a really long time.
Yeah.
So there are all these differences that crop up in multiple fields. But at the same time, I think you ask any sort of red-blooded American patriot, and they would never give it up, even despite these flaws, because they pride themselves on what they call rugged individualism. They like power to be delegated down as far down towards the individual as they can. And they're actually very fearful of what they call the tyranny of a central government. They actually do not like that at all.
Okay, the one last thing that I wanted views on is the debate that always comes about, the debate about electoral college votes. Harsh Pant, what's your view? Should that be done away with?
I think clearly, the flaws of the system are being exposed with every election that we have seen in recent memory. So the challenges are growing, and as American democracy transitions into a different phase, and I think that's something that we should also consider. For all that Mr. Trump is doing today and is saying today, there are larger questions about the fundamentals of American society, American polity shifting in front of our eyes over the last two elections. And he, whether he wins or loses, he has changed American politics, the kind of coalitions that are being built, the kind of class structure that is responding to those changes. For example, working class voters increasingly moving into the Republican camp. 2 successive elections where Mr. Trump has been able to take them away from traditional Democrats. These are supposed to be Democratic voters. These are long-term structural changes in American politics happening in front of our eyes. And whether we like Mr. Trump or not, he is the one who has ushered them in through default or by design. And those changes are not being reflected in some ways with what is happening with the kind of structures that are in place, like the Electoral College. And I hope that this debate starts in America about what to do with it. But clearly, there are enough stakeholders who want to continue with the status quo. And I think it will be a long haul before they actually start repairing some of the damage that this structure has brought. But again, as I think we have been discussing, it has also been something that people like about it. States having more power, and the fact that governors are so important, the fact that power is devolved, and the fact that federal structure is so powerful in terms of state rights and state powers. I think these are all questions that Americans are very proud and they are very passionate about. And I don't think it will be that easy to do away with the Electoral College system, as perhaps sometimes we think when we debate these challenges during every election over the last few decades. We have been doing that.
Yes, and I think the debate just gets fiercer. I mean, and from my own limited understanding, but though, at the end of the day, Shubhajit, it actually boils down to saying that how can there be more representation for people from one part and lesser, or how can their vote count more and value more than the vote of a person from another part of the country?
Absolutely. It's grossly unequal, the representation due to the Electoral College votes. And that has been one of the flaws of the system. Also, this system has been underfunded, grossly underfunded by the central as well as the state provincial governments. And that has been pointed out in several reports, several reforms that have been proposed earlier by different committees in the Congress or by think tanks in the US system. I remember visiting the Federal Election Commission office in about 2 elections ago. And I remember the Election Commission office was smaller than the South Delhi Municipal Corporation office, and talking to some of the officials, it felt like they were really underpowered. We feel that our election commission is very empowered. They were under-empowered in that sense. And that is something I think puts an inequality in how laws are implemented in states. Every state is free to decide on how to register, who can vote, when to count, all of that. And, simple things like posting a mail-in ballot is itself different. States have different criteria. In some states, you can just sign your ballot and send in. In some states, you may have to produce an ID. In some states, you may have to produce an ID plus 2 witnesses. Now, for an ordinary American living in a suburban area or in the countryside, all these makes for much more complex. So it's not an easy act. It's a very antiquated and difficult act riddled with hoops, bureaucratic hoops, which prevents voting to take place. And for a society which prides in speed and and ordering a coffee from Starbucks is easier than casting a vote. So that is how complicated it has become. Whereas in India, we find that in the remotest corners, people are able to vote with ease. I think that is something the Electoral College and the electoral system needs to sort of fix if in the coming years they need equal representation and a less complicated process for their elections to be conducted in.
Okay, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have all of you on this panel. I wish by the end of it we had an answer to who the next US president will be, but we will have to wait a little bit longer. Hopefully that answer will come to us without too many legal battles being fought, or even with and definitely without any unrest or violence unfolding in United States. Thank you to our panelists. For your viewers, this is how it stands right now. There is still lack of clarity. but the numbers suggest that Joe Biden is leading. Neither of them are too close, and it is going to come down to a handful of states where counting is moving on very, very slowly, painstakingly slow, simply because lakhs of people have chosen to mail their vote, have chosen to take the postal ballot, the mail-in ballot route, which means all of those lakhs of votes have to be counted, which is why it is taking so much time. Usually also you see a large percentage of voters deciding to do that, but of course in times of a pandemic that number has just shot through the roof, putting a load on the entire system. Donald Trump is preparing, and by the passing minute it becomes clearer and clearer that he is going to put up a tough fight, and he is going to go all guns blazing against the mail-in ballot system. He is calling it an election fraud, and how an election that he had won fair and square according to him, with the people coming out to vote for him, is now being taken away because of the mail-in ballot fraud, as he alleges. But there are experts who will tell you that a larger percentage of Democrats have chosen the mail-in ballot form because their party campaigned on this and asked them to choose this route rather than stepping out in times of a pandemic. And so as more votes now get counted, it is going to, in some parts, give a better result for the Democrats. 5 key states where the election is too close to call right now, and we don't know how it will be in the morning. But stay tuned to Mirror Now. We will get you all the updates. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.